January 14th, 1940. Berlin, Germany. The cold, gray light of the morning barely penetrated the fog creeping across the city streets. Inside a small, cluttered workshop, a man in his late 50s stood bent over a table, his eyes fixed on a set of plans. His name was Hans Weber, a man whose quiet intellect and humble demeanor kept him invisible to the world around him. The blueprint on the table was his, a crude, almost absurd drawing of what appeared to be a bicycle, but a bicycle with a purpose far beyond its mundane role of transport. Hans had spent months, perhaps even years, developing the design. His fingers trembled slightly as they traced the lines of his sketches, tracing patterns that, in his mind, could alter the course of history. His idea was simple: a bicycle that could carry soldiers across enemy lines undetected, faster and quieter than any motorized vehicle. The War Ministry had long abandoned the idea of such innovations, too focused on the massive steel machines that had begun to dominate the battlefields. Tanks, armored vehicles, and trucks, all the machines of war that were slowly but surely eradicating the human element of the conflict. Hans believed there was still room for a simpler solution. His colleagues had laughed when he first pitched the idea to them. A bicycle, Weber? One had sneered, his face contorting with disbelief. We're fighting a war of tanks, not toys. Are we supposed to send our soldiers into battle riding bicycles? They all mocked him, dismissed his idea as outdated, a relic of a time long past. But Hans didn't care about their laughter. His mind had seen something they couldn't, something that could potentially save lives and outsmart the massive, lumbering forces on both sides of the war. He had no military rank, no prestigious title, and his only weapon was his mind. The officers and generals around him, high-ranking men with all the power and authority, were trapped in their rigid thinking. They saw only what had always been done. There was no room for the unexpected, no room for innovation that didn't fit their predefined molds. That's what Hans had come to understand. The military was not just a machine of war, but a machine of inertia. It moved in one direction, and to change its course, you had to find a way to slip through unnoticed like a shadow. Hans had been a civilian engineer before the war, skilled at designing bicycles and vehicles, not weapons or military apparatus. But when the war had begun, and Berlin had been engulfed in the frenzy of military buildup, Hans had seen an opportunity to use his talents. He knew the advantage of stealth, the advantage of speed over brute force. In his mind, the bicycle was an elegant solution to a problem that most military minds couldn't fathom. The workshop where Hans worked was a modest one, located in the heart of the city. It was a quiet place, hidden among the larger industrial areas that hummed with the sounds of production. It was here that he would test his designs, altering them, improving them, and making them better. And in this space, in the dim light of flickering bulbs, Hans saw the beginning of his revolution, one that might never see the light of day if the generals didn't open their eyes. He had already built a prototype, a bicycle designed for both speed and endurance. The wheels were thicker, the frame reinforced, and there were modifications for carrying supplies and weapons. A soldier could ride it with everything they needed for a covert mission. No loud engines, no bulky tanks that would alert the enemy to their presence. The bicycle could move through forests, across fields, along narrow roads, unseen and unheard. The machine wasn't just practical. It was a symbol of defiance against the military establishment. Hans spent hours refining the prototype, poring over every detail. As he did so, his mind often wandered back to the conversations he'd had with other engineers, the way they'd looked at him as though he were a fool. They had no time for his primitive ideas. They had seen the power of tanks, the endless march of armored vehicles, and they could only think in terms of more, bigger, stronger. They couldn't see what Hans had seen, that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't the one that could crush your enemy with force, but the one that could slip past them undetected. The first test run of the bicycle came on a cold morning, the kind of morning that made the streets of Berlin look like they had been abandoned by the world. Hans had invited a few colleagues to watch the test, though he had little hope they would be impressed. He set the bicycle at the edge of a quiet road, checking it once again for any faults. His heart raced, and for a moment he thought of backing out. But no, he couldn't. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. A soldier from the local army garrison volunteered to ride the bicycle. He was a young man, hardly out of his teens, with a look of skepticism on his face. Hans adjusted the soldier's helmet and handed him the handlebars. "Just follow the road until you reach the marker," he said quietly. "And make sure you stay quiet. The idea is to remain undetected." The soldier nodded and, with a slight hesitation, mounted the bicycle. The soft whir of the wheels as they turned was almost imperceptible in the cold morning air. As the soldier disappeared down the road, Hans felt a wave of hope mixed with dread. If this worked, it could change everything. If it failed, well, then there was nothing left to do but return to the drawing board. Minutes passed. The soldier's figure became a distant silhouette, swallowed by the thick fog. Hans watched intently, every muscle in his body tense. When the soldier finally returned, the look on his face was all the confirmation Hans needed. He dismounted with a wide grin, almost breathless. "It worked," the soldier said, his voice barely audible in the wind. "I didn't make a sound. Not a single patrol saw me. This thing could be it." Hans stood there, staring at the bicycle, the first true validation of his vision. But even as he allowed himself a moment of triumph, he knew that the battle wasn't won yet. There was still the rest of the military establishment to convince. The generals, the officers, the bureaucrats, they wouldn't be easily swayed. In the end, it wasn't enough to have an idea. You had to make them see it, to force them to recognize the potential in something they didn't even understand. As Hans returned to his workbench, his mind raced. The bicycle was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of everything the war was losing. The human touch, the element of surprise, the ability to think differently. But for now, he would have to wait. The battle for recognition had only just begun. March 6, 1941. The Eastern Front, Soviet Union. The snow had started to fall heavier, as it always did in the depths of the Russian winter, turning the vast expanse of the frozen wilderness into a land of endless white. The Soviet soldiers, already beaten and bruised by the relentless Nazi advance, were not prepared for another harsh winter, one that would test their resolve in ways they could hardly have imagined. The war was grinding on, a brutal stalemate where tanks rolled across the frozen earth, and men in trenches fought for inches of ground that meant everything and nothing all at once. Among them, in the near silence of the snowy landscape, a small group of soldiers rode swiftly on bicycles. The wheels sliced through the thick snow, leaving barely a trace behind them. These men were not the seasoned veterans who had fought in the endless battles of the last 2 years, nor were they the officers who dictated orders from the safety of headquarters. They were the ones who had been given an impossible task, armed with nothing more than Hans Weber's design and a deep sense of urgency. They were tasked with slipping past the massive, clunky German military machines that had begun to dominate the battlefield. At the head of the group was a young soldier named Alexei Petrov, barely 20 years old, a man who had never seen a bicycle before the war. Alexei had been a farm boy before the conflict, raised on the wide, empty plains of Ukraine, and he had never imagined that he would end up here, riding a bicycle through the frozen wilderness of Russia with a rifle slung over his shoulder. But the war had changed everything. It had taken his home, his family, and his innocence. It had also pushed him into a role he never thought he would fill. Now he was part of something far greater than himself, something that could, just maybe, turn the tide. He glanced over at his fellow riders, each of them focused, their eyes fixed on the road ahead. They rode in silence, their breaths coming in short bursts that vaporized in the cold air. The bicycles had been modified for speed and efficiency. The tires were thick and sturdy, able to handle the snow without sinking, and the frames were reinforced, capable of carrying extra supplies and ammunition. But it wasn't just the bicycles that made them valuable. It was the element of surprise. The Germans, with their massive tanks and military vehicles, had little to fear from something so small, so inconspicuous. And, That was exactly why these bicycles had the potential to turn the war on its head. As they glided through the snow-covered fields, Alexei thought back to the first time he had seen the bicycles. They had been brought to their unit with no explanation, just a message from higher command: use them, and do not question why. At first, Alexei had been skeptical. He had grown up thinking of war in terms of tanks and machine guns, not two-wheel vehicles. But once they had taken their first test ride, the possibilities had become clear. There was no noise, no rumble of engines to give them away, just the soft sound of the wheels against the snow. It was a stealthy, efficient way to navigate the terrain, to scout enemy positions, to deliver messages, and, if necessary, to make a quick escape. The Germans, on the other hand, had no such advantage. Their tanks rumbled across the battlefield, their engines bellowing loudly, their treads leaving deep scars in the earth. They were powerful, yes, but they were also slow, cumbersome, and predictable. And when they weren't on the move, they were vulnerable. It was this vulnerability that Alexei and his fellow soldiers sought to exploit. They would infiltrate the German lines with speed, gathering intelligence and relaying it back to the Soviet command, and they would do it all while remaining hidden in plain sight. The operation they were currently engaged in was one of the most dangerous missions they had yet undertaken. Their objective was simple: infiltrate a German supply line and gather vital information about their movements. It was a mission that could change the course of the war if they succeeded, but the risks were immense. If they were discovered, they would be caught between the German forces and their own. There would be no escape, no reinforcements to save them. They were alone, with nothing but their bicycles and the element of surprise to rely on. As they approached the German position, Alexei's heart began to race. He could see the shadows of soldiers patrolling the perimeter, their silhouettes barely visible through the haze of snow. The Germans had set up camp in the distance, their heavy vehicles parked in neat rows, like beasts waiting to be unleashed. The Soviet soldiers crouched low, their bicycles silent beneath them. Alexei could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. This wasn't just about gathering intelligence anymore. This was about survival, about defying the odds. One by one, the group passed through the German lines, weaving in and out of the thick snow, their movements fluid and precise. The Germans were oblivious, their eyes scanning the horizon for larger threats, not for the small, nimble figures that passed by. Alexei's breath came in short bursts, his heart hammering in his chest as they made their way deeper into the camp. He could hear the faint murmur of voices ahead, and for a moment, it seemed as if time had slowed to a crawl. Every movement, every sound felt magnified, like the entire world was holding its breath. Finally, they reached their objective, a supply truck filled with documents detailing the German troop movements. Alexei gestured to one of the soldiers to grab the papers. But as he did, there was a sudden noise, a shout, a rustling of movement. Alexei's heart stopped. The Germans had spotted them. "Move, move," he hissed, grabbing the papers for the soldier's hand and pushing him forward. The snow, which had once felt like a cushion beneath their feet, now felt like a trap. They pedaled furiously, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the camp as possible. The sound of boots crunching in the snow grew louder behind them. The Germans were in pursuit. Alexei's legs burned as he pushed harder on the pedals, the cold air stinging his face. His mind raced, the fear threatening to overtake him, but there was no time for fear now. They had a chance to make it out. They had to take it, and then, just as quickly as it had begun, the chase was over. The German soldiers had lost them in the blinding snow, unable to keep up with the speed and stealth of the bicycles. Alexei's heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as he clutched the documents that could change everything. The mission had been a success, but the victory felt hollow. It was only one small victory in a war that seemed endless, and Alexei knew that the dangers were far from over. As they made their way back to Soviet lines, the significance of what they had done began to sink in. They had outsmarted the Germans, using nothing more than bicycles and a deep understanding of their own limitations. In that moment, Alexei realized that the true power of the bicycle wasn't in its design, its speed, or its stealth. It was in the way it defied the assumptions of the military establishment. It was a symbol of innovation in a world where innovation was often buried beneath the weight of tradition. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the key to winning this war. December 19th, 1942. Moscow, Soviet Union. The victory had come, and with it, a sense of relief that swept through the weary ranks of the Soviet army like the first warmth of spring after a brutal winter. The Germans had been pushed back. The Eastern Front, once a symbol of failure, had become a place of hard-won triumph. Yet, as the war raged on and the celebrations began to fade into routine, there was one name that remained strangely absent from the accolades: Hans Weber. It had been nearly 2 years since Hans's bicycle had proven its worth on the harsh terrain of the Eastern Front, since it had allowed small, agile Soviet units to infiltrate the massive German lines and gather crucial intelligence. The bicycle had become a symbol of ingenuity in a war defined by brute force, a testament to how an unconventional idea could shift the tide of battle. And yet, despite its success, despite the lives it had saved and the victories it had contributed to, Hans's name had not made its way into the history books. In the chaos of war, amidst the constant churn of strategies, victories, and betrayals, Hans Weber had faded into obscurity. He had not been a general, not a commander whose name could be chanted by the masses. He had not led a battalion or delivered a grand speech to rally the people. He had simply been an engineer, a man whose genius had been dismissed, whose vision had been silenced by the deafening roar of military tradition. And as the Soviets began to rebuild after their hard-won victory, Hans found himself discarded, his contribution erased by the same forces that had once dismissed him as a fool. The officers and generals who had once laughed at his bicycle now took credit for its success, claiming it as another part of their brilliant strategy. They had seen its value, of course, but only after it had been tested in the fires of battle, and only after its success was undeniable. They had no intention of giving Hans Weber credit, not when the war was still ongoing and when every ounce of recognition was claimed by those with the most power. In the Soviet Union, it wasn't enough to be right. You had to be seen as the one who made the decision, the one who wielded authority. Hans had returned to his small workshop in Berlin, alone and largely ignored by the world. The official records had no mention of him, no acknowledgement of his contribution. His bicycle, the simple invention that had made so many things possible, was now an afterthought, an artifact buried beneath the weight of military bureaucracy. He was, in many ways, a ghost in his own time. His invention had changed the course of history, yet no one knew his name. The irony was bitter. Hans had spent his entire life quietly observing the world around him, taking in every detail, noticing things others overlooked. He had always believed that true innovation came from the smallest, most unassuming of ideas.